What is the truth in the stories we are told? We've been given a story of a world fueled by separation. We've become separate from one another, separate from the earth, ultimately separate from the true nature of ourselves. It's time we learn the truth. It's time you rewrite your story. It's time to realign with who it is that you really are. This is the fifth dimension.
You are infinite and eternal. We are infinite and eternal.
Our natural essence, we could say, is simply being.
We have this awakening coming together as a perfect storm.
We're ready for this. We have the capacity inside. We just got to find that.
All right, everybody, welcome on into the Fifth Dimension podcast. For today's show, I have a very important guest, and I'm joined by Scott Schara, and he's going to tell the story of his daughter Grace, and it's really a heartbreaking story. And I just want to open up it with the notion that I feel very blessed to be able to hold this space because this is an important message. So it's be likely a little emotional. This is some of the darker truths of what is going on behind the scenes. You're not going to see this in the mainstream press or any of those corporate sources that have an agenda. So Scott, thank you for taking the time to come on the podcast. Truly my deepest condolences about Grace. I mean, I go and I look at her photos and hear you talk about her, and she really has such a strong presence and light that I could feel just by hearing this story. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh boy, thanks for having me. And what you said about Grace is true. I mean, Grace had a following in our area. I was just Grace's dad. Nobody, that's what I like to be called yet, because she was a star in our area, and God took her home early.
Mm-hmm. Right. I would love to start. I mean, I would love to hear a bit more about Grace. I mean, sometimes when we get into the stories about, what may happen, and we'll obviously get into what happened at the hospital when, you took her there. But I would love to have the listeners really get to know Grace as well. Like, what can you tell us about her, and really should shine that light.
Yeah, so she, that's really perfect, because she did shine a light, and she shined our Lord's light. She called me earthly dad. That was her sense of where she belonged, which is pretty neat. Grace was 19 when she died. She had Down syndrome. She was very high functioning. My wife did a great job schooling her. We homeschooled her, and Cindy, my wife, taught her how to read and write. Grace rode a horse regularly. All the way back since she was 3 years old. We got her involved with therapy so she could learn how to speak. Mm-hmm. And she, obviously could read and write. She could drive. I taught her how to drive. She was a comic. I thought at one time that she might be in Vegas doing stand-up comedy, and I would be her sidekick, because she had a way about her that was, she could command a room with her jokes. So she would, just to give you an example, she would, if she met you for the first time, Evan, she would say, "How are you, handsome Evan?" And then she'd say, she might say some version of this, which is pretty common. She'd say, "Would you want to hear my dirty jokes?" And so, of course, nobody can turn that down. So then she would say, "Well, why didn't the toilet paper cross the road?" And then, of course, you say, "Well, I don't know. Why not?" And she said, "Because it got stuck in the crack." So that was the first dirty joke. And then she'd hit you with the next one, which is, "Have you read the book Under the Bleachers?" And of course, nobody has. So you say, "No, I haven't." And so then she'd say, "Well, would you like to know who it was written by?" And of course, yes. And then she'd tell you it was written by Seymour Butts. So that was.
Oh my gosh, I love it.
She was so sharp. She could pick up on stuff that most people were blind to, because she saw things through a lens of love. She just loved every single person. And that's why I think Grace's story is taking off, because people can just see it when they start looking at her website or they hear us talk. Tom Renz, who everybody's familiar with, he had me on a podcast a few months back, and then he had me on a second one just to talk about Grace. He fell in love with Grace, and he has taken us under his wing to help pursue some of the legal things that will inevitably be part of this situation. So thanks for letting me talk about her for a bit.
Oh, absolutely. And I made sure that was what I wanted to start with, because, I want to make sure this is humanized for people, and people really get that full understanding of, the light that she does shine, because I witnessed it in other interviews that you did, and just going and seeing her pictures, like, and seeing the smile, like it's very evident to me, right? I can definitely feel that resonant, loving energy. So I'm glad we started with that. So could you talk about, um, Grace, you took her to the hospital sick with COVID. Can you talk about, um, you know, decision to do that, and sort of what ended up happening when you went in there?
Sure. The decision to do it is something, of course, now in hindsight, that's one reason we're doing these podcasts, is because I want people to know that, number one, you don't have to check into the hospital. And if I would have known then what I know now, Grace would be alive. And then number two is, when you hear the details of the story, most of us in some time in our life are going to have to go into a hospital. And the time to check the hospital out is not when you're in the emergency room getting ready to be admitted. You've got to find out in your area which hospitals have not been bought by the government. And you're going to understand what I mean by bought as we get into the story. Because if they've been bought by the government, there is an extremely high chance that you will not come out of that hospital alive. And so that's the second point as far as the immediate take-home message. That's why we're considering this message absolutely urgent. You don't have to go to the hospital with COVID. And then number two is, if you have to go to the hospital just in general, Grace's case has nothing to do with COVID, as you'll see in the end. So as we just navigate through what happened, our best guess is that Grace got COVID around September 28th, and simply because she had a sniffle at that time. And we were fully prepared at home. We had all the frontline doctors protocol, and she was on a vitamin regimen before the sniffles. And then we put her on ivermectin right away. And we really didn't think anything of it. Just thought we'd walk through COVID. We're fairly healthy as a family. And ultimately on October 6th, Grace could not maintain her oxygen above 90%, which motivated the emergency room visit. And so the specific situation there is, just because you have low oxygen doesn't mean get admitted to the hospital. We could have gone home specifically with a prescription for oxygen and a steroid, and Grace would be alive today. And just jumping ahead, 3 days after Grace died, I ended up in a hospital with COVID. I was about 3 times worse than Grace. And so you'd think, well, how did you both end up in the hospital, given that you were healthy and on the frontline doctor's protocol? And I can't answer that with 100% certainty, but I think I have the answer by studying. I have about 500 hours of research into Grace's case after she died. And one of the things that I found is there's a doctor in South Africa by the name of Dr. Chetty. And he has had over 8,000 COVID patients, and came to the conclusion that if a patient has a predisposition to clot and produce inflammation, they will not be able to maintain their oxygen. And I have both of those conditions. And I knew that before COVID. I was diagnosed with heart disease about 4 years ago. And then I've had two surgeries lifetime. Both times I had blood clots. So I knew I had those conditions exactly that he talked about. So likely Grace inherited those as genetic dispositions from me. My wife had COVID at the same time, really worse than Grace and I. And yet she maintained her oxygen above 95% the entire time. So that at least closes that loop in case people would ask. So, ultimately then, this was on October 6th. We were in the emergency room. The emergency room physician suggested that Grace get admitted to the hospital. And I didn't really think anything of it. You have this perspective of trusting the white coat. But I did say I will be staying with her then, and immediately had an objection that was, well, you can't. I said, well, what's the reason? And they said, because our COVID policy does not allow visitors in the room. And so I said, well, I'll be taking Grace home then. And about 2 hours later, they came back and said that you can stay as long as you don't leave the room. So of course I stayed, and we waited about 10 hours in the emergency room for a room to open up. We got into a room about midnight on the 7th. So as we go, Evan, feel free to just interrupt, as I don't want to ramble without questions that pop into your head.
Right.
Do you have anything right now?
Well, I was going to say it's interesting because I hear so many stories about that separation between family members and COVID patients, right? You're not allowed to visit them in the hospital, which is, medically speaking, prior to COVID it's unprecedented, but it goes to show that already I'm feeling the sort of inhumane nature of the hospital policy here in terms of, that separation. And so, I don't have any specific questions about that. You can definitely just continue on. And is there, is that something that you felt early on, I guess, an inhumaneness? Now that I think about it, did you have that trusting the white coat mentality, as you just sort of already mentioned?
Unfortunately, I did. When we get into some of these details, you might think, well, how come you didn't get a distrust as things were going? Because I wasn't comfortable with the care, and I challenged the care, but it wasn't that I got to the point that they're going to kill her. That is, and when I share the details of the story, I've come to that conclusion that they killed her. And whether it was intentional or not, you're going to be the judge after I tell the story. Something I read yesterday regarding this separation of people. Our story is quite unique, not only because Grace had Down syndrome, but we were in the room. So we got to witness the care that people wonder about. And I read an article yesterday that 50% of COVID patients that live have PSTD. So a mental illness from not having family in the room. That is just, that's a hard to grasp statistic.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those tragic situations. And I know you'll get into, I've heard you talked about the ventilators and things of that nature, and wanting to put on people on a ventilator, but things like that have long-term physical effects as well for somebody who were to survive COVID. So to me, and I'll let you continue the story, but to me, I have coming to that same conclusion where there's, even if the doctor, maybe specific doctors are well-intentioned and maybe they don't understand the type of negligence they're performing, the protocols themselves seem to be put in with a negligent intent, if you will. And when you follow them up.
I think that's a great way to frame it, because there can be a percentage of doctors that are uneducated relative to this, but that becomes a responsibility over time. So you can be uneducated day 1, day 2, day 3, but let's say that, all of a sudden a month goes by and you keep doing the same thing and it keeps killing people. Well, now your level of obligation changes. You can't just keep relying on a protocol and that becomes your excuse for continuing to do something. So, if the protocol that you were following before every podcast was to hit your hand with a sledgehammer, would you, it wouldn't take you more than one time, right? You wouldn't do that before the podcast anymore. You change the protocol, right? because it hurts. So people are dying, they're seeing people die. We saw this. So when Grace went in, the overall culture of the hospital, I haven't talked about this much, but when I started writing my write-up after I was kicked out of the hospital, I titled it 110%. This is before I knew Grace was going to die. And the reason I titled it 110% was because that was the excuse that they were consistently giving me. When I would challenge things, they would say, well, we've been doing this already for 2 years. We're giving 110%. Well, they weren't giving 110%, because if you were giving 110%, you wouldn't keep doing the same thing over and over and expect different results. I mean, the results are statistically, you are going to die in the hospital. That's just a fact.
Yeah.
So why would you do that? So, I mean, the first, you mentioned about the ventilators. I'd like to just hit that first, because, October 7th was Grace's first full day in the hospital. It was fun. I really expected a mini vacation with Grace.
Mm-hmm.
Toward the end of the evening, we had a battle with getting a BiPAP mask situated, which I'm going to cover when I cover October 8th. So October 8th, the doctor came in at 8:00 and said, you're going to have to put your daughter on a ventilator in the next 2 hours. And I said, well, what is that based on? Now, at this point, I had the ventilator paradigm that was introduced, I believe, unknowingly by President Trump, which was when COVID first came out. He said, we have a ventilator shortage. We got to convert factories to produce ventilators. Like, a ventilator is something that helps save people.
Right.
And so I had that perception. So when he said it, I didn't immediately go negative, but I'll explain why I did. So he said, well, the reason is we did a blood gas draw last night, and it shows that she needs a ventilator. And I said, what time was the blood gas draw? And he said 11:30. And I said, well, at 11:30, me and 2 of the other nurses had just got done wrestling with Grace over this BiPAP thing. And I said, she was really not stable. Her blood pressure was 235 over 135, and her heart rate was 150 beats a minute. So I said, I don't believe those numbers are objective, and I want you to retake the test, which they did, and Grace was fine. So they were going to use a false test to convince me to put her on a ventilator. So then I asked, while I had his attention, what's the prognosis? And he said only 20% of people walk out of a hospital alive once they're on a ventilator, which that was a piece of the truth. But I mean, it got me thinking. And afterward, of course, I found out that the real number is about 15%. And of those 15% that walk out alive, most of them die in the first year because of damage done to their lungs. And what got me into this is the attending nurse started crying. And so I talked with her, and she had a daughter named Grace, and she knew that if I chose to put Grace on a ventilator, Grace was going to die. So now I became anti-ventilator at that moment. And the hospital staff, the doctors, asked Cindy and I. Cindy was the medical power of attorney for Grace. They asked us 4 different times subsequent for a pre-approval, pre-authorization, you could call it, to put Grace on a ventilator just in case. And just in case was when they determined, and they would frame it this way. They said these type of things tend to happen in the middle of the night when we can't get a hold of the family. So we rejected those requests every single time because we weren't going to give them the authority to do it. If Grace really needed a ventilator, we're going to be involved. And, we were convinced at that point that the idea of a ventilator we would never agree to that. And Grace never got close to needing a ventilator. But after the fact, I traced the money for a ventilator. And this is another take-home message for people. You're going to get a call that Uncle Joe died in the hospital. So then you start tracing it back, and you'll see he was put on a ventilator. Well, why is he put on a ventilator? And the next piece of this story I tell you is how they justify a ventilator, because they really want to get Uncle Joe and anybody on a ventilator. Why? They make about $300,000 when the patient or their family agrees to a ventilator. There's a COVID bonus of 39 grand. The average stay in a hospital when somebody's on a ventilator is 22 days. And then they're classed ICU. So and they have to be on a sedation drug. So between the COVID bonus, the ICU classification, and the sedation bonus, that's all government bonuses. Then on top of that, they have 22 days of insurance and patient pay. It's about a $300,000 payday for the hospital. So they're financially motivated to pursue that path of foolishness at the expense of the patient.
Wow. Yeah. And you see the ventilator in the corporate news, for example, as the savior, right? It's like, oh, put people on a ventilator as I guess there's an understanding that a ventilator is not a good prognosis. I think a lot of people may already know that, oh, the situation must be dire, but they view the ventilator as like a last gasp, when it sounds to me, based on what you've already said, is the ventilator is what causes a lot of these premature deaths, or and especially you see in Grace's case, where if you hadn't been mindfully aware of, the ventilator situation and how Grace actually was, and as a patient, and that she didn't need it, they would have put her on it, and that would have been, she would have fallen victim to that in particular.
Right, and they would have gotten away with her death then, because they would have used the blood gas numbers to justify the ventilator. Then she would have died on a ventilator, and they would have been able to get away with murder. And as opposed to what happened here, in Grace's case, they're not going to be able to get away with murder, because now we were there and we have an overabundance of evidence of how they pulled this off. So the next thing is the next example I want to give you is how they will justify a ventilator. So the next morning, which was October 9th, Grace was hungry. I ordered food. I started feeding her. A nurse came running in and said, "You can't do that." And I said, "What's the reason?" And she said, "Her oxygen saturation is only at 85%. And I thought to myself, for about 15, 20 minutes, I thought, that can't be. And I had all of my COVID materials in the room because I figured I would get COVID while I was in the room with Grace. So one of the things I had in the room was my own oxygen saturation meter. So I put it on Grace's finger and it read 95%. So I called the nurse back in and asked her if my meter was accurate. And she said, "Yes, it is." And I said, "Well, what is the reason your meter isn't reading the same as mine?" And she said, "Well, the leads get sweaty." And I said, "If that's a known fact, why don't you proactively change these leads out every 3 or 4 hours or whatever it takes so you have an accurate reading, given that this is the primary statistic you're using to manage my daughter's care?" And she snottily responded, "You should just be thankful you caught this." I got a hold of the Medicaid records after Grace died and found out during the 7 days she was in the hospital, they only changed out those leads 3 times, even after I challenged it. And the cost billed to Medicare was only $78 a change out. So, I mean, it's ridiculous that they didn't do that. So they are arbitrarily lowering the oxygen numbers to justify a ventilator. And I can prove it. I mean, that example proves it, but then I monitored Grace's oxygen regularly. My daughter, Jessica, who became a replacement advocate, did the same. And on Grace's last day, an hour and a half before Grace died, Jessica had the oxygen meter on her reading at 93%. The 2 oxygen meters from the hospital, one was reading 67% and one in the 50s. I mean, so it's that far off.
Wow.
And they're using these numbers to justify putting the patient on a ventilator. And how can you argue with it? We could argue with it because we're there. Okay. Right. But if you're not there, so now you start challenging, well, how come you needed a ventilator? And then they start showing you Uncle Joe's oxygen saturation numbers. So then, I mean, how do you argue it?
Right.
You don't have the ability to argue it because you weren't there. So, I mean, they have this whole system. Oh my gosh, it is so corrupt. You can't make this stuff up.
Wow. It's unbelievable. And it's a blessing in a sense that you were there to be able to actually expose in real time that this was happening. Because just the fact that her oxygen was 93% an hour and a half before she died shows that, she was thriving in a sense, right? I mean, obviously, maybe there was still a level of care that was needed, but there's no justification for a, I would say, something, her quote unquote dying of COVID, right? That's what they're framing it as. Like, you're not going to go from 93% that oxygen level to dead in an hour and a half, right? That's not a realistic, like, medical slope she's going down. Like, I would love to hear about. So she didn't get put on a ventilator at all, but so what was the level of care that she did end up receiving while you were in there? What was the hospital's other measures that they began putting in place, because she wasn't going on the ventilator? So what did the rest of her care look like?
Well, I'll give you two examples. I mean, the care I would judge as about a D plus. There's some things that they got A's on. For example, the nurses, after Grace was on a BiPAP, came and swabbed her mouth to keep everything moist. And I thought those nurses knocked it out of the park, so I would give them an A. Proning would be an example where I would give them an F. So proning is a known help for oxygen. So proning means laying on your stomach. So the doctor suggested this day, I think it was the morning of the second day. I thought, boy, this is a great idea. I looked it up. I had my laptop in the room, so I was looking up their recommendations, and boy, this makes sense. And I had a lifeline with a doctor outside the hospital, and so I got her involved, and she agreed, same thing. So then I tried to get the nurses involved to help, because Grace is hooked up to stuff. You can't just do it by yourself. Mm-hmm. They refused to help me. They would not do it. Grace did not get proned until day 6. Grace died on day 7. So, I mean, that is terrible. Another example would be feeding. So, I mean, I gave you the example where they wouldn't let me feed her, but it really gets worse than that, because these nurses that would swab Grace's mouth, how they did it, they would remove the BiPAP and they would put on a high flow cannula, but they would turn the rate down. This high flow cannula Grace hated. She got on that the first day. In hindsight, you realize she never needed to be on any of this stuff, but we won't go on that rabbit trail. But the high flow cannula, they had this air going up her nose at about 40 miles an hour. So what these nurses would do to swab her mouth would be to take that high flow cannula, but turn it down on low pressure. So Grace tolerated it just fine, and it didn't drop her oxygen. So when it came to feeding, I said to the nurses, all we have to do is do the same thing that the nurses do, because a BiPAP mask covers your mouth. So I said, all we have to do is do the same thing that the nurses do when they swab Grace's mouth, which is pull the BiPAP off. Grace could eat fine. She was perfectly fine, but she couldn't feed herself with all this stuff on. So then you just put that high flow cannula on low pressure and you feed her. She would have done just fine, but they would not do that. They said, well, the doctor said it has to be at this setting. I said, it doesn't have to be at that setting. I've watched them do it. They would not listen. It's like I'm the dumbest person on the face of the earth. They would not listen to anything. So, I mean, those are examples on the opposite end where they got an F. So, I mean, Grace was in an ICU unit, but I mean, she wasn't in ICU at all. Grace stayed in the same room the entire time, but they put her on a sedation drug called Precedex. So then legally, that drug put her as an ICU patient. Nothing changed. The room didn't change. The care didn't change. Nothing. So anyway, I would say the overall care I'm just judging as a D plus, and these are just a couple of examples.
Right. And again, this is an example of most people aren't going to see this type of care that goes on. The fact that you were in the room and able to witness this and look with a critical lens, it's a blessing to be able to share that, because most people, once they go in, if they go in for COVID, it's a solo experience. Like, the patient is isolated, the family can't see exactly what's going on. They just have to blindly trust that the best interests of the patient are being met. And it seems very obvious that that is not the case for Grace. And how, like, so was she during this process awake, conscious, still having that sort of loving spirit? Like, what was her, did she have thoughts about what was going on during this, and or questions, and what was sort of her?
Outstanding. I mean, yeah, she was just Grace. I mean, she was wonderful. And I look at her when you said, did she have thoughts and things? You know, Grace was, Jesus was obedient unto death. I think I've only shared this one or two other times, but that's how I see Grace. She was obedient unto death. So at one point she said to my daughter Jess that the nurses are idiots. That was very rare for Grace. So yes, she had thoughts. I mean, she could see things. She was a smart kid. So, but she would be obedient as just a matter of choice. I mean, these people were in an authority position. She wasn't really bucking things, and you're going to hear this as we get into her last day. So that's how I look at it. I think, one of the interviewers had made the comment that Grace died a martyr's death. And I think that may be why all these doors are opening up to share the story. Because I think that is the case. You know, God had a reason to take her early, and it's to save lives. As I'm telling you the story about Grace's care, so as you wisely pointed out, Evan, this is the care she was receiving, and we were there. So think about what the real care level is like in a hospital room. Right. It's substantially worse than what I'm explaining. I'm giving them a D+, and that was with monitoring them and challenging them. And, so it's obviously an F if you're not there. The next day, which I ended up getting kicked out the next day, which was Sunday, the 10th of October. And the head nurse came in with an armed guard and said, you need to leave immediately. And she said, the last 3 shifts of nurses don't want you in the room. And it's because I was challenging, as I've explained to you, I wasn't mean to them, but I mean, it's you can't make it. It's like, can't you connect the dots here? Why won't you listen? And,
right.
They would not listen. So ultimately, then we were 44 hours without an advocate. We had to hire Grace's special needs attorney to negotiate with the hospital attorney to get my daughter Jess in. Cindy had COVID, so she couldn't come in. So, Jess finally replaced me 44 hours later. During that window, what they did to Grace, we don't have the details other than the lies they put in the reports, but the one statistic that we know happened. So while I was still in the room, they put Grace on a sedation drug called Precedex. This is what they did here is the first thing that would be illegal. Everything else you could say, well, it's just part of hospital protocol. But Precedex is a sedation drug that instantly classified Grace's room as ICU. In the records, it shows they started her on this on October 9th. The package insert, which is the rules they're supposed to follow, says to not use it for more than 24 hours. They had Grace on it for 4 full days before her last day. And Precedex is used for anesthesia for surgery. So the anesthesia nurses who have reviewed Grace's case have said it's only supposed to be used for 3 hours maximum. And during the time where we didn't have advocacy, they increased the dosage 7-fold while we weren't there, trying to basically a medical malpractice nurse who reviewed the records at Tom Renz's request concluded that they chemically restrained Grace. So they used a chemical to restrain her, and I would say mainly because they could, and I think it's specifically because she had Down syndrome. They didn't want to, they were lazy. And as we conclude, when we get to the end, I believe there's genocide involved with with Down syndrome people. And I believe I can prove that with the newest evidence that I've uncovered over this last week. Anyway, so Jessica experienced a great day with Grace the day before she died on October 12th. And so much so that the night before Grace died, she called her two boys, Grace's nephews, on FaceTime, and Grace sat up in the bed with the BiPAP on and hollered to and waved, "Hi, boys," just as she was being Grace. Jessica monitored Grace's oxygen all night. The night before she died, it was at 98 to 99% all night long. The next morning, the doctor called us. Now we're going to walk through Grace's last day, and it's pretty bad news. So I mean, if you're so far, we've walked through some details that you think, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But when we go through this last day, it connects a whole bunch of dots, and it is the story becomes almost unbelievable. And that's why if you check out Grace's website, which is ouramazinggrace.net, and if you look at the tragedy tab, what I'm going to go through is all documented on the tragedy tab. And the purpose of doing that is so that you cannot just believe what I'm saying. Look it up. All this information that's under the tragedy tab is copies and assembled from the hospital records and records that we've received outside the hospital. So I have copies. Everything is there to document what I'm going to tell you next. It's hard to grasp. So the doctor called us at 8:00 and said, Grace had such a good day yesterday. By the way, he was calling because he wanted our pre-approval on a ventilator again.
Of course.
We told him no. And he said, well, Grace had such a great day yesterday. I think we should put a feeding tube in. So you go back to why did she need a feeding tube? She was malnutrition from not being fed because of their desire to not feed her. Right. So, we foolishly approved that. And now we start walking through what the day. So now Jessica said she's going to take a shower to the ICU nurse that was on Grace's care nurse that day. This ICU nurse was a 14-year ICU nurse, very experienced. She told Jessica, you can't take a shower here. Remember when I was in the room, they said I could not leave. So I showered in the room. So Jessica was told she had to go home. She came back inside of an hour. When she got back, she overheard two doctors and this ICU nurse in the hallway say the family is not going to like this. So she said, what aren't they going to like? And they told her we had to restrain Grace while you were gone, which means strap her down to the bed. So she said, why? And they said because she wanted to go to the bathroom. One of the attorneys that we are working with asked me, Scott, do you think that you would have been strapped down for wanting to go to the bathroom? And this is where I say Grace was just obedient. Okay. I said, no, I wouldn't. And that Sunday after he said that, I went through all the doctor's reports another time. There's 22 doctor's reports that were written for the 7 days Grace was in the hospital. In those 22 reports, they mentioned that Grace had Down syndrome 36 different times.
Wow.
They used that as an excuse to ratchet up the sedation drug. Shortly after that, they wanted to do the feeding tube that Cindy and I approved. The nurse that was assisting the ICU nurse said, shouldn't we wait for Grace's numbers to rebound? And she said, no, this would rebound after strapping her to the bed. I mean, they made her go to the bathroom in the bed. So, I mean, they would not, the ICU nurse said, no, we're not waiting. So then they put this feeding tube in, which then, of course, Grace got agitated. They ratcheted up the Precedex to maximum dose at 10:48 that morning. After 10:48, Jessica was in the room the whole time. She reported Grace was basically out of it. She was not functioning. 8 minutes later, the doctor put an illegal DNR on Grace, and that we of course didn't know that at the time. We just got these records about a month ago, and it exposed that truth of this tragedy. At 11:25, they gave her a dose of Lorazepam. And Grace was already out of it. Why are you adding another med? And at 5:46, they gave her another dose of lorazepam. Now, I want in this 29-minute window that I'm going to go through next, she was at max dose Precedex. They gave her at 5:46 a dose of lorazepam, 5:49 a dose of lorazepam. 6:02 is when Jessica recorded these oxygen numbers still at 93%. Grace was a fighter.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to take her out. That's what I've become convinced of. So at 6:15, they gave her morphine as an IV push. The morphine package insert is the most damning document. It's on Grace's website. And it says specifically to not combine those drugs because it causes death. It also says specifically that the nurse is supposed to monitor the patient bedside with the reversal drug. None of that happened. They left Jessica alone with Grace in the room. Jessica felt Grace getting cold. She asked the ICU nurse, "Is this normal? Can I get a temperature?" And the ICU nurse just told her, "Use a blanket. It's normal." It's not normal. It's normal if you want to take somebody out. Then a phlebotomist came in to do a blood gas draw on Grace. They couldn't get the blood gas draw because Grace's veins are collapsing. Jessica asked her, "Is this normal?" "Yeah, it's normal." I mean, this isn't normal at all.
Mm-hmm.
Jessica called us at 7:20 on FaceTime, panicking. She said, "Dad, Grace's numbers are dropping like crazy." I said, "Get the nurses in." She said, "I've been trying, they won't come in." She estimated 30 nurses in the hallway at this time because of the shift change. So Cindy and I started hollering, "Save our daughter." They hollered back, "She's DNR, do not resuscitate." This is the first we knew it. We hollered back, "She's not DNR, save our daughter." Jessica ran into the hallway and one of the nurses had it right up on her on the computer screen because Jess asked, "What's going on?" And on the computer screen, she reads off, "The doctor put a DNR on Grace. We can't do anything about it." So no nurse came in that room. We watched Grace die 7 minutes later on FaceTime at 7:27. Afterward, we find out from Jessica, there's an armed guard posted outside the room. And it wasn't a casual walking by. Jessica crawled in bed with Grace to hold her after she died or after they pronounced her dead. And I don't know for sure that she was even dead then, but they pronounced her dead. And she crawled into bed waiting for me to drive Cindy to the hospital. That armed guard stood outside and watched Jessica the whole time from the nurse's window.
Unbelievable.
After Cindy and Jess cleaned Grace up, I sat in the truck because I had COVID. Our pastor met us there, funeral director. After everything was done, the pastor walked Cindy out in a wheelchair. And one of the nurses had Grace's belongings on a cart and walked next to them and leaned down and said to Cindy, "Me and several of the other nurses don't think Grace should have died today." That's what gave us the clue that something wasn't right. And it started a whole research process. And ultimately I'm here today because of all the doors that have opened through the research on what happened with this, which we can dive into next. I just want to stop here so you can go through questions.
Yeah, no, and it's absolutely heartbreaking to hear that, and just to relive that and tell that story over and over like you do. I mean, that's courageous on your part. I want to acknowledge that and give you the
Don't give me any credit, Evan. God's doing this. I mean, there's no way you can do this on your own. You can't retell this story on your own. You can't do it. I mean, God has, for some reason, picked a simple dad to just get out there and share the story. And that's who deserves the credit.
Right. Absolutely. And I feel there's something I think truly sacred about being able to share Grace's light and share this story because of, I think the larger mission at play here is when you talk about the different combination of medicines and all of the last day protocols that they had. Did you find any financial incentives again for these types of medicines, or sort of is this a common practice that's going on behind the scenes at hospitals. What was, and then the same thing with the do not resuscitate. What, because when I hear this, and I'm not involved in the medical system, so I wouldn't know what their normal policies are, right? But I can hear that and know that that is not at all the right thing to do. And it seems to be clear negligence on the part of the doctors. And it's interesting to me that the nurses came in and said that they don't believe she should have died, but then at the same time there wasn't any nurses who came in to intervene or really assist what they may have known. So
So your questions, let's see if I can take them in order, and if I miss something, let me know. So you asked about the financial incentive. I want to hit that last. The DNR, they violated at least 8 state statutes with the DNR. First, it's supposed to be signed by the power of attorney for healthcare, which is my wife. Of course, that wasn't signed.
Yeah.
They didn't put a DNR bracelet on Grace. When a patient or their advocate tells you she's not DNR safer, that overrides the DNR no matter who puts it on. Those are the top 3. But when you drill into the statute, there's a whole bunch of things. As far as the bonuses with the meds, the only bonus we're aware of is for Precedex, because that classifies Grace as an ICU. But we look at more of the financial piece. What I believe as I drilled it down. So God has been unbelievable through this. One Sunday morning, he always gets me up at 3:00 when he wants me to do this research for some reason. So I got up on a Sunday morning and put together a slide that's on Grace's website under the tragedy tab called The Love of Money. And that's probably, I don't know, it's probably 80 hours of research, but I was able to do it in 4 hours because God was behind it. Anyway, what I concluded as far as the money, so the hospital, relative to Grace now, not the bigger picture, but relative to Grace, the hospital received a $13,000 bonus for killing Grace. If Grace would have lived, they would have got nothing. On Grace's last day, the hospital was at literally 100% capacity, and the emergency room was filled to the brim. So just connect the dots here. I received the bill the hospital sent to Medicaid. They were only making $1,680 a day on Grace. Why? Because we wouldn't approve the ventilator. So Grace was really a low producing revenue source for the hospital. Hospitals at maximum capacity, emergency rooms at max capacity. They get nothing if Grace lives. A 14-year ICU nurse delivers the meds. The combination of meds, we have an intensivist that said it killed her. Every medical professional that looks at it says it would have killed anybody. So now you wonder, right? Mm-hmm. So then you add in Grace and I waited in the emergency room for 10 hours for a room to open up. So as I've connected the dots with the money, I believe what happened is the financial grid that I believe the hospital has going on behind the scenes is Grace was the one to take out, because it didn't make sense financially when we have potential $300,000 emergency room patient waiting. This girl's not making us any money. So that's the money piece of it. So
no, that's heartbreaking. That's because when you go to a hospital, you want to assume that they are, again, and I said this earlier, you want to assume that you're going there and they're helping people get better, get like from an illness, like, right? Now, if I were to check myself into a hospital, I'm going to assume I am going to be taken care of, and I'm not just viewed as a statistic in the sense of that this is how much money I can bring the hospital, and this is my financial line, if you will, right? And it shows the inhumane system and what people I think a lot of people are going through, especially in this behind closed doors, right? And the fact that we can even see and expose this it's kind of unbelievable because of the your due diligence while you were there and consistency while you were there, really was able to shine a light on this. Do you have, what are, I guess, the legal ramifications moving forward? I mean, I know you've mentioned lawyers and whatnot. Is there a way for accountability and justice for this sort of malpractice? I mean, because to me, it almost it doesn't feel like there's legally there's nothing that can actually make up for what happened, right? There's no settlement. It's inexcusable. So how can we find any sort of justice or for grace and for others who have dealt with this, because this is a large scale operation?
Well, this is huge. So large scale, if you look at Grace's website under urgent, I have tied this large scale together with Agenda 21, which is the agenda that was adopted in 1993 at the UN for reducing world population. So if you start with that macro view as to what's going on, and then take it down to what's going on with Grace's case and how do you get justice, you're going to find out, and I have all this stuff on Grace's website. It's all tied together. They're all in on it. And this isn't just a dad talking. The research is there, but you got to spend the time. I've assembled it all, so it isn't literally typed out. I have the links to support every single thing that I've come to the conclusion of. But as you drill it down to individual justice in Grace's case, so when we discovered they killed her, we had gotten the records by the 3rd of November. We went through the records with a doctor, and by November 8th, we concluded they killed her. We put everything together. We just assumed naively that the hospital would want to know and then share this so that they could change. So we requested a meeting with the CEO and the doctor, gave them everything, all the summaries, everything, and they refused to meet with us. And we got that report or that email from them refusing to meet was dated December 2nd. That's when we decided to go public. So what we did to show how they're all in on this, we sent the 2 specific agencies in Wisconsin. I sent complaint letters out to 4 different agencies. The Department of Justice was one. They just said they didn't have time. That's at a federal level. But the 2 state agencies, one is an agency that regulates doctors and the other one regulates hospitals. Unbelievably, they both did investigations and came back that the doctor and hospital did no wrong. And you'll see the reports on Grace's website. And when you see all the research, I sent all my research to them. And you'll see, oh my gosh, there's an overabundance of research here. And it spells it all out. But they rejected it all and said they did no wrong. And their reports are on the website. You can check it out for yourself. You can't believe it. And so you think, well, why, what is going on? And so I've concluded that the hospitals have become arms of the government to implement a genocide campaign. That is one of the campaigns with population reduction. The vaccine is another one, but that's not my wheelhouse. I'm just talking about one avenue because that's what applied to Grace. So, a lot of people have known what I had to self-discover for decades. They've known this is going on, but I didn't know, you just kind of naively go on with your life. You don't really trust the government, but you don't think that they're completely corrupt. And, I've had to self-discover that they're completely corrupt. And, so what is specifically happening? Through COVID, the average patient in the hospital generates a $100,000 bonus to the hospital system. The hospital instantly knows when you check in what type of insurance you have. So they know who's on Medicare and who's on Medicaid. Those are the first 2 segments of the population to take out. So the people on Medicare are the elderly. The people on Medicaid are the disabled. The disabled person in a hospital is 11 times more likely to die. That doesn't make any sense unless there's an agenda behind it. These two groups of the population, the elderly and the disabled, are the most expensive on the government's budget. Those two segments of the population cost 39% of the annual budget, $2.2 trillion a year to the US taxpayer. So there's quite a motivation. If you process that, you drill it down to the cost per person, it's $32,000 per person on those programs. Well, Grace was on Medicaid. If they can pay $100,000 as a bonus to the hospital and save $32,000 a year forever, it's got a 3-year payback period. So that's how they're greasing the wheels to make the hospitals do their dirty work. And now the statistics for COVID are coming out. So when, think through this idea that 11 times more likely if you're disabled to die in a hospital. I mean, there's a reason behind this. And, what I'm telling you, you might think, well, you're a conspiracy theorist, whatever. Well, I'm a fact teller. And these are all facts I found. And you call it what you want. I don't care what you call me, but I'm obligated to share the facts that I have found. And these are the facts.
Yeah. And, I've done a lot of research on Agenda 21 and looked into what's this larger depopulation agenda. And it's heartbreaking to see it, to see the direct results of that and to hear the stories of that, and I've studied history, and it's in all genocidal movements. For example, who do they start with? They start with disabled and elderly, and the parts of the population that are they have more dependencies, they're more expensive, as you mentioned, right? And anybody who is listening to this, and I think the people who need to hear it the most are the ones who maybe especially are still trusting of the hospital system, right? You get this message out to people, and it's easy for somebody who hasn't come across this story to label you a conspiracy theorist, label me a conspiracy, whatever, right? But I think we need to recognize the humanity here. And I see you're a grieving father, like you lost your daughter, and we look at Grace, like, well, let's look at the real emotions behind that, the real pain that you feel. Let's celebrate Grace's life and actually look at the facts behind it, instead of buying into our old beliefs about the government or not wanting to get into conspiracy theories. Like let's be with the facts, be with this tragedy and learn from it, because it's for the amount of pain that it has caused. It's tragic, but there's also a light that you're now shining, and that Grace is still shining, that people can use this and learn from it. And really, as you mentioned, there's a grand purpose, I suppose, in this, and with that comes a lot of more obvious mourning and pain, but more people are going to be saved. And it seems to me that the truth, it's coming out more rapidly, in a sense, right? And more people are starting to question these policies. And I don't know, the truth can't be contained forever. So even if justice can't be served necessarily in the frameworks of our legal system, in the grand scheme of things, I have no doubt that the nature of God, the nature of how the world operates, that justice is already being served. It's already, the truth is already coming out. And, we have to sort of have faith in that divine plan, that divine purpose moving forward.
That's really a perfect way to start wrapping up, because I actually didn't specifically comment on justice before, but just so viewers are aware, of course, you have the concept of medical malpractice, and I would really just call it a concept, because they have immunity under the CARES Act through the PrEP Act, and medical malpractice is exceedingly tough to prove, even in cases like Grace's.
Yeah.
So that's a tough angle. Criminal is another angle. All these things, if God opens up the doors, we're going to pursue. We have attorneys involved already. We've got, it's an overabundance of evidence. It just, God has to open the doors, and we'll walk through them at that time. But, the real justice is, God says vengeance is mine. So, he's going to make everything right in the end. The best justice for us, I would say, we've already gone on record that we're not going to take any money if we end up walking through these doors. And, what I would like to see personally as justice is that Grace's death certificate would be changed to the truth. But from a way bigger piece, the best justice of all would be the people who are doing this. So the doctors and nurses at the street level implementing these policies that are killing people, for them to repent. That would be the best justice and become children of God. Because I don't want, as much as this is egregious and my daughter's gone, all of that, you don't want your worst enemy to spend eternity in hell. And so if they repent, that would be the absolute best justice that could ever be served in this situation.
Absolutely. And that it's interesting because it's probably tough to, I can only imagine trying to find within yourself like forgiveness. And maybe it's impossible to forgive, the people who do this and things of that nature, but we recognize that we are all children of God, and that the forgiveness it can be healing for ourselves to say, I'm going to allow the grand justice to serve, right? And not go into that vengeance mindset, because it's easy to hear things like this and want that revenge, but that's not the purpose behind what you're doing. And I can definitely feel that. And you're really shining a light on the truth. And, Grace, her light, I think is a big part of that too. She is still shining a light, despite her passing, right? I witnessed my father pass in a hospital setting 5 or 6 years ago, but it's interesting how after somebody passes, their light with it, like the light that I feel from him, it's stronger than I did 5 or 6 years ago, right? So that light that when a loved one passes and their legacy, it only grows, right? And it only expands. And in Grace's case, that's so clearly the evident, especially because the world is learning about her and gets to see who she was and what happened. So
so that's right on. Regarding forgiveness, God had to work that in my heart. So you said it would be impossible for a person to forgive, and that is technically true. Forgiving a doctor and nurse who killed your daughter, and intentionally, even, again, I said you be the judge after hearing this, but it seems pretty clear at this point.
Yeah.
So how do you forgive that? And the answer is you can't. Only God can work that through you. And I'm thankful that He did that with me, because it allows me to tell this story. If I just was out to get them, you couldn't tell this story so that it shines a light on evil. And that's really what Grace was doing that her whole life. And I'm honored and humbled to be able to do it now. I can hardly believe I'm able to do it. It's wonderful that this opportunity is presenting itself to shine light on evil.
Right. And the work that you are doing and the difference that you're making, it's saving lives. And Grace is saving lives, right? So it's beautiful. Like I feel blessed to have been able to have you on the podcast and to share the story, because it's one that's so powerful. And I know that people listening, I feel the impact sitting here talking to you. I know the listeners are going to get that as well. Is there anywhere, I know you mentioned the website, that they can keep tabs on, because this is a story that's I feel like is only just beginning, only just getting started, and this is going to continue to evolve and grow. So is there anywhere, just you would want to send anybody who's tuning in, anywhere they can donate, where they can continue on with this research? I know you mentioned the website that you created.
So the website is changing generally at least a couple times a week because there's always new information. And we have a place on the website for people to share their stories that we're posting so that they have an avenue to do that, because we want to accumulate these stories for an eventual bigger class action or however God opens that door. But the website is ouramazinggrace.net. We do have a Give, Send, Go link there under how can you help? And there's also a link to the Facebook page. And so we have a Facebook page now that just started a few weeks ago. Going backwards in time, we did a rally on April 8th. So you can check out the rally. That was a pretty big deal. The city of Appleton closed down a street for us right across from the hospital. So we had a rally literally right outside the hospital. It was wonderful. We're doing, I don't have this on the website, but if you look at all the news links are on the website, you'll see stories about the billboards. We have a big billboard campaign going on locally where we have a dozen billboards along the highway and some of them on lesser highways, but the main highway that goes through this area, we have billboards sharing the story, and that's getting a lot of traction. If you're right that this is just the beginning, that would be fantastic. At the beginning of sharing the story, a few people thought that Grace might be the face that brings all of this down, and she would be the right kid for it because she wouldn't hurt a fly, and her love would be what brings it down, not any work that I do, that's for sure. But Grace's love heals everything, and her love would bring this whole house of cards down. And if we're going to be part of that, let's go.
Absolutely. And I definitely feel that there, the darkness cannot stand when light is shining upon it. And the amount of light that Grace is bringing to the world right now, it would blind a lot of people. It's that powerful. So Scott, I want to thank you again so much for coming on the podcast and sharing the story. I mean, I would love to have you back on again in the future as, the story continues to unfold and this evolves, and, just continue, we can continue to spread awareness and the work that you're doing, and through this tragedy, it can't be quantified. So the difference that you're making. So I can't thank you enough for allowing me to hold the space for you to come on and getting the opportunity to share this out.
Well, thanks, Evan. I got goosebumps just hearing you say that. So thanks for having me. It's really it's really a blessing to be here. Thank you.
No, the pleasure is all mine. And all the listeners, thank you for tuning in, and definitely head on over to this website, which is in the episode show notes. So everybody can just scroll on down and click it right there. And that's going to wrap up this episode. So see you all next time.